Hello, everybody. I just wanted to go through one of these project examples from Lambda School and show how we can further expand on exception handling and how we can implement some validation into our models. So as we can see here, if I run this application how it is, and this is the user email application, simply users have emails, users can have many emails, and it's one of those relationships. So if I go over here and I authenticate, and authentication's already handled in this right now. If I authenticate and I go into my body and I send over an empty object, I get this cannot invoke string to lowercase because user email is null. That's because this object right here is being forwarded to our controller, and even though you have an @valid annotation, it's being forwarded straight to the service. So that's not exactly the act that we want. So if we go over here into our model and take a look at our user email, we'll see here that we have a column and it is set to not nullable. Unfortunately, this is only for the database. This does not get caught by Spring. So we need to provide a way for Spring to know that this should never be null when it gets passed in as a parameter into our controller. So to do that, it's basically the same as this @email annotation. It comes from the javax.validation.constraints class. And it's a property called not null. When you add this property on there, then Spring itself will check to make sure that the object being sent in has a string or whatever this property is supposed to be, and it is not null. You can add whatever other kind of JavaX validation constraints on there, such as minimum, maximum. This email will be handled as well, but as it stands right now, nothing will still happen. It will be caught, but it'll give you a sort of ugly message. So if we fire this back up, go back into our authorization, request a new token, send it, and here we see our message is different. So it did not get forwarded to our service. It did get caught in the controller, but as you can see here, it's throwing an error because our parameter add user email parameter 1 has there's an error in there. And the error is this: the object in user email on field user email rejected value null. Now, this is a totally different exception than what we've been handling before. So if we go into IntelliJ, we'll see here that this resolved, it is actually a method argument not valid exception. And in the full example that John had provided to us, in the handlers, it was handled here, but it was handled with helper functions.getConstraint violations. Unfortunately, these are different violations. They're not constraint violations, they're field errors. So we have to find a way to convert these field errors into constraint violations, so that instead of this long developer message, which is very confusing for the front end to read, it's simply going to throw some front end friendly errors in this list right here, which, as we can see, is not it's an empty list. So let's take a look at our model for validation error, and we'll see that for validation error, all we need is a string code and a string message. So let's head back into our helper function under services, helper functions. So what we need to do is we need to output a list of validation errors, but instead of taking in a throwable cause, we're going to be taking in a list of field errors. And this list of field errors is generated automatically by the method argument not valid exception. So we're going to create a new helper function, and this is going to be return a list of validation errors. We're just going to say field errors field errors to validation errors. It's going to take in a list of field error. We're just going to call it errors. So this right here, we're going to input that into, actually, let's implement it first. So to implement it, Control O and add that. So what do we want to return? We want to return a list of validation errors. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to loop through this list of errors, and for every error, we will create a new validation error and append it into this list of validation errors. So we're going to write a for field error in errors. We're going to create a new val error, new validation error, and we're going to say new val error dot set message. So this message should be what went wrong. So we'll say error dot get default message, because if you can see here, this default message is must not be null. So you'll be able to, you'll see here in a little bit that the way it's structured with the validation errors, the custom validation errors, is that it's very human readable. So this, we'll set the message as that, and we'll set the code to dot get field. So this field is the user email, and then the default message will be the error that is thrown on one of these annotations. For instance, if they don't send you in a user email, it'll say user email should not be null. If they send a malformed email address, it'll say user email, and then it'll have some sort of way of saying should be a well-formed email address or something along those lines. And I believe if you do this, yes, you can actually go here, click on message, and say, here is my custom email error message if you send in a bad email address. So now this message should be the one that is shown when you send a malformed email address, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. So we'll have this. So we've looped through all of these. Now we have to add them. Oh, we don't want to add that one. We want to add the new val error. And then we're going to return all of the validation errors. So now that we are converting our field errors into validation errors, we want to implement that into our helper function. Not the helper function, but the handler, the exception handler itself. And we want to handle it in the method argument not valid, which is being thrown right here when you send a property that is violating one of those constraints from the javax.constraint.validation class. So instead of calling in our get constraint violations, we want to call in our field errors to validation errors. And what we're going to pass in is our exception dot get binding result dot get field errors. And that returns the list of field errors. And then instead of this developer message being set to the binding result dot to string, we're just simply going to set this to the class name. So that way it'll be a lot more human readable. You'll know exactly what class is throwing this error. And then the front end will be able to see all the constraint errors that are being thrown. Also, one thing to note is that in the controller that this is taking place, you have to have the @valid annotation on there. If you do not have the @valid annotation on there, it will not check for validation errors, and it will forward it right to the service, if that's where you're sending it. In this case, we are forwarding it right to the service. And I have done some modifications to this because the way it stood out before was that an email was being sent as a parameter, but I want the email, in this case, to be sent in as an actual object, just for the example. So Let's check to see if this is working. All right, let's go to a new access token. Check our body. We have an empty object, and let's send it. Boom. We have errors. Code, user email, message, must not be null. So what happens then? If I send in a user email that is malformed, and there is your custom error message that you send on a bad with a bad email address. So this is, if you remember, this is the message that we provided for our email annotation. I believe you should also be able to set it there as well. Yes. So very powerful, very flexible, and very helpful for front ends.